Welcome back to the Deep Dive. So our job here, as always, is to really dig into the hidden mechanics of power and politics, try and make them clear.
Make sense of the systems behind the noise.
Exactly.
Yeah.
We're not about the slogans today.
Yeah.
We're interested in the systems. And we got a really fascinating case study. It's applying a kind of rigorous engineering analysis to urban politics, specifically the recent rise of Zohran Mamdani in New York City.
It is genuinely unique material we're looking at. Most political analysis, it focuses on the drama, the personalities, or maybe the ideological clashes.
Right.
But the sources you share, especially the work by this analyst and engineer, Levny Moten, it just strips all that away. He looks at this campaign, well, not as some kind of moral crusade, but purely as a mechanism.
A mechanism versus a crusade. I think that's the perfect place to start. So our mission today, our deep dive, is really to follow that analyst's thinking. We want to trace the flow of influence, figure out where political ideology stops being just a belief and starts functioning as, well, currency. The analyst's core finding, his main thesis really, is that this campaign was, and this is his phrase, a transaction disguised as a crusade.
That phrase really captures the, let's say, necessary cynicism of doing systems analysis, doesn't it? And the most compelling part of that transaction, for me anyway, is what the source calls this new ideological chemistry emerging in urban politics.
A new chemistry.
Okay, it's this fusion, a fusion of two really powerful, quite distinct forces. You've got radical economic populism on one side, and then the sort of structural moral power of religious identity on the other.
Wow, okay. That is a potent mix.
Yeah.
Let's break that down a bit. So economic populism, that's the scaffolding.
The intellectual
That's
part.
it gives you the language, right? The language of justice, fairness, redistribution.
Yeah.
It provides the whole framework for saying, look, the system's broken, and here's why.
Got it. The why. Precisely. It's the intellectual framework. But, frameworks alone don't win elections. So the second piece, religion, or maybe more accurately, the mobilized faith network that brings the moral energy, the conviction.
The engine.
The engine, yes. And just as importantly, it supplies the volunteer infrastructure. The actual people, the foot soldiers, who turn those big ideas into knocking on doors, making calls.
And then there's the third element, the modern layer, that makes it all work logistically.
Right. Digital money and these interconnected nonprofit networks, they provide the means to quickly turn that belief, that moral energy, into really sophisticated, measurable campaign logistics, fundraising, targeting, outreach.
So putting it all together. It's why the analyst sees it as an ecosystem of motives, not just one single pure movement.
It's exactly an ecosystem. And to map it properly, the source gives us this really structured analytical framework. He basically insists that to understand any governing coalition, you've got to look at the campaign through three specific lenses based on what each group is actually seeking as a return on their investment.
Okay, three lenses. Lens number one focuses on capital and influence.
That's right. Institutional and business actors, think unions, companies, the big PACs, they're putting in capital, strategic help, because what they want back is influence. A seat at the table, basically. Affecting policy, regulations.
Makes sense. Lens two.
Lens two is about legitimacy. Public and nonprofit organizations, foundations, advocacy groups, they aren't after profit. They want ideological continuity.
Continuity, so getting your ideas locked in.
Yeah, getting their policy agenda, their way of thinking about change embedded right into the city structure. Their payoff is seeing their mission gain legitimacy and traction.
Okay, and the third lens, that's the individuals.
That's the massive base of private individuals. Everyone from, high net worth tech donors down to the thousands chipping in $5 online.
Right.
Their main drive isn't capital or even specific policy points. It's more emotional. They're seeking belonging.
Belonging. Social connection, identity.
Exactly. Being part of something, part of a winning story.
Yeah.
So if you map how these three motivations influence continuity and belonging overlap, that's how you see the moral story translating into an actual governing coalition.
That sets us up perfectly for section one then. Getting into the political economy of this movement, you mentioned the source argues it needed those two distinct currencies.
Dual currencies, yeah. You absolutely cannot separate them. You needed the financial capital, the actual money. But you also needed the moral authority, the legitimacy, the energy, the enthusiasm.
Right, because one without the other doesn't work in modern politics. Yeah.
Precisely. You need the capital infrastructure, the PAPSIGs, the funding streams to run a modern campaign. But you need that moral currency to generate the excitement, the volunteers, that kind of populist energy you need to really challenge the status quo.
Okay, let's start with the capital side. The source goes into detail about these major institutional players, the sort of progressive muscle that provided money and strategy.
Yeah, he lays them out. First on the list is the Unity and Justice Fund. This one provided sort of the initial organizational backbone and some early funding. Its importance, the analyst notes, is its connection to established civil rights groups.
So instant legitimacy.
Instant moral and legal legitimacy for the campaign's core message right from the start. It's less about huge sums of money here and more about that organizational capacity and validation.
Then there's the Working Families Party PAC-C, a familiar name.
Yeah.
They act as a kind of brand validator on the progressive left-right.
Absolutely. For Mamdani, they supplied that critical ideological branding, the stamp of approval, but also, very tangibly, the ground game infrastructure. Canvassing, data, voter outreach, the professional nuts and bolts of campaigning.
Okay. But the main money engine, the source says, the real high-volume cash, came from the New Yorkers for lower-cost PC.
That's the one. And this is where that idea of polyphonic rhetoric really starts to play out on the financial side. The PC's big banner message was simply affordability for all.
Affordability for all. Okay, explain that. How does a phrase like that appeal to, say, socialists and business interests at the same time? That seems like a stretch.
Well, the analysis suggests it's actually quite brilliant branding. For the traditional progressive base, affordability clearly means things like universal rent control, social housing, maybe wealth taxes, the classic socialist toolkit.
Like standard stuff.
But for more pragmatic business interests, maybe mid-sized companies, real estate folks who aren't the mega developers, affordability for all can mean something else entirely. It can mean a stable, functional city.
Predictability.
Exactly. Predictable costs, a healthy consumer base, reliable infrastructure. A city that's wildly unaffordable becomes chaotic, and that's ultimately bad for almost any business. So they can donate under this affordability banner, claiming they just support stability, even if they personally might, balk at the full socialist platform behind it.
It's a strategically ambiguous tent, allowing different motives to coexist. And connecting this whole financial layer to the corporate world was another PC, the one NYC business outreach peak.
Yeah, that one played a really critical role, according to the source. It acted as the bridge, the connector, for those corporate donors who weren't necessarily ideologically aligned but could see which way the political winds were blowing. They saw progressive governance coming.
So hedging their bets.
Essentially, yes. They weren't trying to stop the movement. They were trying to ensure, pragmatic coexistence. Their investment was about buying access, buying influence with the likely new administration, making sure their interest would at least be heard when it came to things like zoning changes or new regulations.
So for all these big institutional players, the Unity Fund, WFP, lower costs, One NYC, the analysis says the underlying motive was basically the same.
It converged on one goal, yeah. A Mamdani victory meant guaranteed access to the next generation of power brokers in the city. It was an investment in future influence.
Okay, that covers the capital infrastructure. Now let's shift to the other currency. Moral capital.
Yeah.
The legitimacy, the energy. You said it came from two different flanks.
Two distinct flanks, yeah. Both driven more by passion and ideology than by straightforward transactional returns, though the returns were still expected.
So flank number one.
That was the Secular Progressive Foundation Network. The source specifically points to personal donations from founders linked to the Heising-Simons Foundation as an example. These are high-net-worth donors, but a specific type. They aren't primarily looking for profit or, deregulation.
So what are they looking for? What's their return?
They really embody that desire for policy access and ideological continuity we talked about earlier. Their return is policy-driven. They want to make sure that issues central to their foundation's mission, things like climate action, education reform, human rights, are actively championed within a friendly city government.
So their donation is an investment in getting their specific policy agenda integrated.
Integrated, not just given lip service, yes.
Okay. But the source suggests the real engine of moral capital, the sheer energy, came from the grassroots.
That's the argument. Thousands of small donors, volunteers, many, the source notes, drawn from specific immigrant communities or Muslim backgrounds. Their individual contributions might be modest in dollar terms, but their enthusiasm was incredibly high.
And that enthusiasm translates into
tangible political force. It's identity affirming for them. They saw Mamdani's rhetoric about social justice, dignity, as speaking directly to their community's experiences and their fight for recognition. So their small dollars plus thousands of hours of volunteer time turned into that essential real-world presence. knocking on doors, amplifying the message online, just the sheer visibility that builds legitimacy on the ground.
The source also mentioned tech donors in this sphere.
Yeah, a specific subset. Tech entrepreneurs whose contributions were partly about moral alignment, sure, but also, the analyst argues, critically about brand management. Aligning themselves publicly with a progressive winner looks good in certain circles, especially in a rapidly shifting cultural landscape.
Okay, so let's pull all these pieces together. The strategic PACs, the secular foundations, the faith-linked grassroots energy, the tech donors. This brings us back to the source's main concept, the moral economic ecosystem.
It's a really precise term for it. Ideology provides the legitimacy, capital provides the viability, the means to operate, and identity provides the raw energy.
And the analyst is pretty insistent on this point, isn't he? That while it looked like pure altruism,
It looked like a crusade, yes. But functionally, he argues it operated, and I quote, with the precision of an investment portfolio. Every single contribution, whether it was someone's time, their reputation, or actual cash, was viewed within this system as an investment expecting a specific, measurable return down the line. That transaction, hiding inside the crusade, that's the operating system the analyst describes.
okay, so if the campaign really is a transaction disguised as a crusade,
Yeah.
its success then hinges on managing all these different, potentially conflicting expectations.
Exactly. The funders, the volunteers, the different blocks, they don't all want the same thing. And this is where that concept of polyphonic rhetoric becomes absolutely central, not just for campaigning, but for governing.
Polyphonic rhetoric,
Uh-huh.
meaning speaking in multiple voices at once.
Sort of. It means crafting the message so that different factions can hear their own priorities reflected back at them. It's like acoustic politics, you know? Businesses hear stability. Economic progressives hear redistribution. Faith-based volunteers hear this powerful language about moral justice and dignity. Everyone hears their own echo.
To really understand that bargain, though, the source provides this motivation matrix, or expectation table.
Yeah, the expectation table. It's the analyst's tool, basically, for cutting through the rhetoric and showing the underlying transaction. What did each group really expect to get back?
All right, let's walk through it. Top of the list, the
Yeah.
institutional PACs. Their motivation seems pretty clear-cut, transactional,
Yeah.
policy access, regulatory influence.
Absolutely. And their expected return was concrete, measurable stuff, getting their people into advisory roles in key city departments, having input on big zoning or infrastructure decisions, making sure they had access to city funding streams, basically ensuring the city remained predictable and manageable for their interests.
Okay, then you have the philanthropic foundations. Their motivation was more ideological, right? Policy alignment, continuity.
Exactly. Their return wasn't about money, it was about political integration. Getting visibility for their causes, seeing their specific agendas like climate goals or human rights initiatives woven into the city's framework. Often through pilot projects or getting allies appointed to relevant city offices, it's an investment in shaping future policy direction.
Then the tech donors. Motivation,
Yeah.
reputation alignment, future access, signaling progressive creds.
Right. And their expected return was also strategic, getting included in city innovation programs, maybe landing government contracts for their tech, and generally maintaining their civic reputation by being visibly aligned with the winning progressive brand. It's like an investment in social capital.
Okay, now let's flip to the moral capital side, the faith-linked networks, primary drivers, moral legitimacy, community advocacy.
Yeah, and their expected return was absolutely crucial for the whole ecosystem's public image. They sought cultural visibility, a louder voice in government appointments, especially in those key spots dealing with diversity, immigrant affairs, community development. They essentially traded their volunteer energy and moral legitimacy for guaranteed representation and a seat at the table for their community concerns.
Looking at this matrix, I have to push back a little. It sounds incredibly cynical. Is the analyst really saying that all those thousands of genuine volunteers from, say, the faith networks were only motivated by this transactional exchange? Doesn't that just discount genuine belief?
That's a really important question, and the source, Moten, addresses it directly. He's not arguing that belief isn't real or powerful. He's arguing that within this political structure, that belief itself functions as a form of currency.
Okay, how so?
The primary return for the individual volunteer is that feeling of belonging, identity affirmation, being part of something meaningful. And that's incredibly valuable on a personal level. But the leaders and organizers of those networks, the source argues, they're operating more squarely in that transactional column. They're leveraging the collective belief of their members to secure tangible outcomes like access, appointments, and influence for the group's leadership.
Ah, okay. So the system translates the grassroots belief into institutional leverage for the organizers. That clarifies it. But that entire structure, that polyphonic rhetoric, hinges on the flexibility of words like justice or dignity, doesn't it?
And that flexibility, that very elasticity, is what the source flags as a major structural weakness. He calls it semantic inflation.
Semantic inflation. It's
Right.
like monetary inflation, but with meaning.
Exactly. He uses this analogy. Imagine a dollar bill that everyone agrees is a dollar, but nobody can agree on what that dollar can actually buy. When a word like justice means fiscal stability to a business donor, identity affirmation to a volunteer, and wealth redistribution to a socialist organizer, well, pretty soon it doesn't mean anything concrete at all.
And that creates a problem down the road.
A huge potential fault line, the source warns, especially once the coalition has to actually govern and make hard choices. When you have to pick one definition of justice for a specific policy, inevitably, some factions who heard a different meaning are going to feel betrayed.
Okay. Now, here's where the analysis seems to take a sharper, perhaps more controversial turn, moving from the transactional structure to the core ideological engine. The analyst argues the real driving force wasn't just moral feeling or religious identity, but something unmistakably ideological, drawing heavily from Marxist and neo-socialist traditions.
Yes. This provided the sort of the non-negotiable discipline, the specific vocabulary of oppression and liberation, and maybe the rigid message control needed to hold the coalition together during the campaign.
This feels like the most sensitive part of the analysis.
Yeah.
How does the source handle this, and what's the warning here?
It is sensitive, and we need to be really careful to present the analyst's argument impartially here. Namosin is very clear. He says he's not making an ethical judgment about the ideology itself, but a purely structural one based on historical patterns. He asserts that whenever a totalizing ideology like historical Marxism moves from abstract theory into the practical gears of government.
And he gives examples.
He does. He cites historical cases like the Soviet Union, Maoist China, various post-colonial states. He argues a clear repeating pattern emerges in these situations.
And what is that pattern? How does he connect these huge historical events to a city council campaign?
Structurally, he argues the pattern is the replacement of the initial promises of liberation with a machinery of control. The revolution of ideals, he contends, historically tends to give way to mechanisms of control, scarcity, and often fear, because a totalizing ideology, by its nature, struggles to tolerate dissent or ambiguity. It relies on absolute certainty. That, he argues, is the recurring structural failure.
And that leads directly to what the source calls the fusion warning. This specific concern about combining this kind of political program with the moral certainty of, say, a mobilized faith network.
Precisely. The warning isn't necessarily about religious belief in itself, the source stresses. It's about the fusion of that belief, or any source of uncompromising moral certainty, with an unchallengeable political dogma.
So merging the political means and the moral ends without separation.
Exactly. The source points to history, arguing that this specific fusion, a totalizing ideology merging with an uncompromising creed, tends to cause civic space, the space for debate and dissent, to contract, sometimes rapidly.
And to illustrate this structural point, the analyst draws some really high-stakes historical parallels, not just the 20th century Marxist examples, but also comparing the structure to 21st century radical Islamist movements, like Al-Qaeda and ISIS.
Yes, and it's crucial again to emphasize the comparison is presented as purely structural. We have to attribute this framework solely to the analyst. He sees in these very different historical phenomena the same dangerous chemistry at work. A totalizing political program demanding absolute loyalty fused with the moral conviction of an uncompromising creed. The structural outcome, he contends, regardless of the specific content of the ideology or creed, tends to be the same. Moral certainty plus ideological control systematically crowds out pluralism, diversity of thought, and basic civic tolerance.
So the conclusion isn't that the intentions are bad, but that a campaign starting with ideals of justice is structurally vulnerable to drifting towards an enforced orthodoxy if it internalizes these habits of absolute belief.
That's the structural risk he identifies, which then raises the critical question: how can we, as observers, detect that kind of shift before it leads to major policy problems or institutional breakdown?
Right. which makes those early warning frameworks you mentioned absolutely necessary.
Exactly. They're designed as practical, ideally non-partisan tools, ways to monitor governance in real time and keep democracy, as the source puts it, visible to itself. The whole point is to spot when conviction starts to slide into suppressing pluralism or when loyalty starts to override competence.
Okay, let's look at framework 1, rhetoric and public messaging. This isn't about policy outcomes yet, just the language being used.
Just the language, tracking those subtle but telling shifts that might signal a move away from inclusivity towards exclusivity.
Indicator 1.
A shift in moral framing. You watch for whether universal civic language references to all New Yorkers, all citizens, starts getting gradually replaced by more specific in-group language, like constantly referring to our community or the righteous community. That kind of shift, the source warns, marks an intellectual move from governing for everyone to governing primarily for a specific bloc.
Okay. Indicator 2.
The leakage of religious vocabulary into secular offices. This is when explicitly faith-based terms start substituting for standard civic or administrative terms in official communications. You know, if discussions about budgets or zoning suddenly start invoking concepts like sin or moral redemption,
That would be a red flag.
it suggests an ideological narrowing within the government bureaucracy itself, the source argues, a departure from neutral secular governance.
And the third rhetoric indicator. This one sounds quite serious.
It is. Silence after sectarian incidents. This is about responsiveness. If the administration seems hesitant or unwilling to quickly and clearly condemn polarizing rhetoric or actual incidents of intergroup conflict,
What does that signal?
the analyst argues it signals a dangerous political dependency. It implies the administration might be prioritizing the loyalty of one particular bloc over its fundamental civic duty to maintain peace and fairness for the entire city.
Okay, that's the language. Framework 2 moves to institutional behavior. Looking at measurable actions, not just words, signs of patronage or soft institutional capture.
Right. This gets into the money and the jobs. The first indicator here is financial, discretionary fund clustering.
Discretionary funds.
Yeah.
The small grants, the community pots.
Exactly. Often opaque, hard to track. The framework suggests monitoring where these small grants for culture, community projects, etc. are actually flowing. If you see a clear pattern where the vast majority go disproportionately to nonprofits, closely tied to one specific community network,
Even if they're technically eligible.
even if it's all technically legal, the pattern itself, the source argues, reveals informal patronage. It's a way to reward political loyalty and bypass more open, competitive funding processes.
Makes sense. Next indicator under institutional behavior.
The appointment pattern. This is critical for tracking that idea of institutional capture. The analyst suggests monitoring for overrepresentation of people from one specific faith background or advocacy network, not just in the highly visible top political jobs, but crucially, in the middle management positions.
Why middle management?
Because those are the people who actually control the day-to-day bureaucratic levers.
Yeah.
Regional directors, program managers, compliance officers. If that layer gets heavily stacked with people from one network, the source contends, the culture of the bureaucracy itself shifts. It moves away from neutral public service towards serving a consolidated political loyalty. It's a fundamental change in how the city administration functions internally.
And the third institutional behavior indicator.
Policy consultation bias. This is about who gets listened to. Our advisory meetings, public hearings, policy workshops consistently weighted towards hearing from just one particular advocacy bloc or community network.
And the risk there is?
You lose the plural feedback loops essential for good governance. The administration starts hearing only what one narrow interest group wants it to hear. This dramatically increases the risk of adopting policies that might sound ideologically pure, but are actually empirically flawed or unworkable in the real world. It's how pluralism gets starved of necessary diverse input.
Okay, that leads us to the final, most quantitative tool.
Yep.
The staff composition monitoring framework. The analysts actually put numbers on this, trying to quantify political gossip.
Pretty much. Translating political gossip into numbers, as the source puts it. This framework is designed to be purely neutral, just tracking the data. It involves monitoring the backgrounds of appointees, their organizational links, maybe even merit metrics across key city departments.
And it comes with specific thresholds.
Yes, key aggregate metrics with defined thresholds for observers, journalists, civic groups, academics to use. For example, the percentage of appointees coming from the same identifiable community network.
What's the threshold there?
The framework suggests if that percentage climbs above 40%, it should be flagged as amber. A warning sign signaling concern about potential consolidation of power.
And if it goes higher?
If it reaches or goes above 50%, it's flagged as red. That signals, according to the analyst, a clear structural consolidation has likely occurred, requiring immediate public scrutiny. A 50% cluster suggests the city's administrative culture may have fundamentally shifted from neutral service to primarily serving that single consolidated network loyalty.
Wow, okay. There are also thresholds for financial loyalty, tracking links back to donors.
Yes. If the percentage of appointees who have strong ties back to the same major donor group or original funding patty like the ones we discussed earlier goes above 30%, that signals potential soft patronage. It suggests political bets might be getting repaid through bureaucratic appointments rather than purely on merit.
And finally, there's an inverse measure, looking at diversity.
Right, cross-community representation. If the percentage of appointees coming from outside the dominant network or bloc drops below 25%, that signals a concerning narrowing of diversity. It suggests the administration might no longer be drawing on the full talent pool of the city, but confining itself to a smaller, perhaps more politically vetted network.
And the value of these numbers is?
They move the conversation away from just rumor or anecdote, the source argues. They provide verifiable structural indicators of potential erosion in pluralism or competence. They make the invisible patterns visible.
All these frameworks seem crucial because, as the source insists, the real test comes when campaigning stops and governing begins.
Exactly, the transition moment. Slogans, moral language, they don't hold up as well against the hard arithmetic of budgets, appointments, zoning decisions.
The test of arithmetic.
Okay.
So the analyst outlines 3 specific risk scenarios that can emerge when this kind of moral economic ecosystem, built on these dual currencies, actually tries to govern. Risk scenario A is policy distortion, when ideology starts to outweigh empiricism.
Right. In this scenario, policies begin to drift towards being symbolic rather than actually feasible or effective. For instance, you might see affordable housing plans that prioritize really visible, morally satisfying gestures, like extreme rent caps over the complex engineering or budgetary realities needed to actually build or maintain housing stock.
Leading to unintended consequences.
Potentially, yes, like of freeze in new construction or a decline in the quality of existing housing. Or economic populism, if applied too rigidly without empirical checks, could create budget rules that end up unintentionally hurting the very small businesses the movement claims to champion. You get a policy failure dressed up as a moral victory.
And the safeguard against that?
The source insists on radical empirical transparency, open data, external reviews of cost-benefit analyses for major policies, letting the evidence speak.
Okay. Risk scenario B is identity consolidation. This links right back to those monitoring metrics we just discussed.
It does. If the actual distribution of resources, the grants, the key appointments, starts clustering too tightly around one particular faith or advocacy network, then the perception of exclusion among other groups will inevitably grow.
And that perception itself is damaging.
Hugely damaging for a pluralistic city, the analyst argues. Even if no explicitly discriminatory laws are passed, that feeling of bias, that perception that the system is tilted, can cause different communities to just withdraw, to silo themselves off socially and civically.
So the administration might be saying all the right things about justice.
But if the dashboards tracking grants and appointments show a clear, persistent bias, then the failure is institutional, regardless of the rhetoric. The metrics become essential to spot this and hopefully correct course before real social fragmentation sets in.
And the final risk, scenario C, institutional fatigue. This one affects the civil service itself, the bureaucracy.
Yes, the internal health of the city government. The argument is, when every single policy decision, big or small, from trash collection schedules to major rezonings, gets framed as this high-stakes act of moral redemption or a battle against structural oppression, well, it can make civil servants incredibly risk-averse.
How so?
If the dominant culture within the bureaucracy becomes one where fearing an ideological misstep is more important than striving for efficiency or innovation, the whole government apparatus can just slow down. People stop taking necessary calculated risks. They stop proposing creative solutions because it feels safer to just stick to the perceived correct ideological line.
And the cure for that?
The source argues for procedural normalcy, an insistence that day-to-day the metrics that matter are competence, efficiency, and delivering services, effectively not constant virtue signaling or proving ideological purity.
So if these risks, Policy distortion, identity consolidation, institutional fatigue are inherent in the structure. How does a healthy city administration build resilience? How does it correct itself under stress? The force gives some clear checks and balances.
Yeah, a list of mechanisms needed to keep pluralism from cracking under the pressure. First, proactive transparency. Budget transparency needs to be non-negotiable. Open dashboards, easily accessible, machine-readable data showing exactly where every community grant, every discretionary dollar is going. That instantly undermines the potential for hidden patronage.
Second, active inclusion.
Establishing formal cross-faith advisory boards or similar broad consultation mechanisms. Forcing different advocacy networks and community representatives to actually sit down and deliberate together makes it much harder for any single bloc to just dominate the agenda behind closed doors.
Third, building social capital.
From the ground up, intercommunity youth programs. The source makes this nice sociological point that prejudice tends to travel poorly through friendship networks. These programs build the underlying civic bonds, the social trust, that can help insulate the political system against shocks and polarization.
And finally, a governmental response protocol.
Crucial. Prompt responses to intergroup incidents. The analyst really stresses that in moments of crisis or tension between communities, the language used by city leadership matters immensely in either cooling or inflaming tempers. A vacuum of clear, unifying moral authority from the top gets filled very quickly by extremists on all sides.
And the source's final thought on resilience here is quite stark, isn't it?
It is. He argues that if these basic procedural mechanisms, the transparency, the cross-group inclusion, the competence checks, the prompt responses if they're allowed to erode, then that powerful religious and ideological mobilization stops being an enrichment to civic life and starts becoming a potential threat to it. The cracks in pluralism, he warns, often appear not through laws, but through loyalties.
Which brings us to our final synthesis, wrapping this up. This deep dive really presents a kind of political engineering perspective, doesn't it? Analyzing how power gets packaged, branded, and distributed today.
It started by tracing how genuine belief gets converted into political power. But the analyst's conclusion seems to be that what often drives these successful modern movements isn't necessarily morality itself, but the skillful appearance of morality.
A branding strategy.
A highly tuned vocabulary of virtue, designed perhaps consciously or unconsciously, to disguise the underlying, unavoidable competition for influence and resources that defines any political ecosystem. It's maybe a necessary branding strategy for a complex transactional system.
And the ultimate danger, then, isn't necessarily bad intentions from the outside, but maybe internal self-deception.
That seems to be the core warning. When leaders start to genuinely confuse their own powerful slogans with objective truth, when that moral language completely substitutes for pragmatic analysis and argument, that's when a city stops governing with reason and starts, well, preaching with certainty.
So the real structural test for this kind of new administration, built on this fusion of ideology and moral energy, it won't be about how well they talk about fairness.
No. The analyst insists the real test is whether they can diligently maintain the actual machinery of pluralism, that sometimes dull, procedural balancing mechanism that allows different truths, different interests, different communities to coexist without resorting to intimidation or the suppression of one group by another.
So this analysis, by stripping away the illusion of politics as just a simple crusade of good versus evil, it actually leaves us, the citizens, the observers, with a pretty critical responsibility to maintain relentless civic visibility, to keep asking the hard questions, the ones that the theater of moral urgency often tries to drown out.
Yeah, the source is adamant that maintaining clarity means we have to constantly strip away the virtue signaling and demand basic honesty, clarity, and reason. And he suggests we constantly ask ourselves these kinds of questions.
Who is really benefiting from these specific policy shifts, these appointments?
Who is actually deciding which interests get prioritized and which get ignored?
And maybe most crucially, who is being quietly left out? Whose concerns are being sidelined while we're all applauding the apparent moral virtue of the leadership?
Recognizing that politics at its core is always an ecosystem of competing motives, some noble, some pragmatic, some self-interested, that recognition, the analyst concludes, is absolutely essential. Essential for governing and for being governed with clarity, with honesty, and ultimately with reason.